So in Mahayana Buddhism, there is a Sanskrit word, adhisthana, which means blessing. It's quite a magical word because it refers to the sort of spiritual blessing that a receptive practitioner might receive in deep meditation, direct from the transcendental level of their being. That word is doubly appropriate place to start because that idea, the blessing of the transcendental, is really the subject of my talk on Buddhism and Neoplatonism. But it was also the place in the UK called Adhisthana that I was set on this particular journey. As many of you know, Adhisthana was adopted as the name of the beautiful headquarters of Triratna in Herefordshire in England. An especially appropriate name because the acquisition in 2012 of such a perfect property in such a perfect location and for a relatively low price was indeed a great blessing. The complex of buildings, including a men's community and a women's community, and the combined team runs retreats and events throughout the year. Significantly, Adhisthana was the home of Sangharakshita, the founder of Triratna. And from 2013 until his death in 2018, when he died, at that time in 2018, his accommodation in that building was turned into a sort of museum called Urgyen House. So on a visit in October of last year, Sarah and I were able to go into Urgyen House. And if you go, you're able to visit Sangharakshita's room, his living room, which has been left exactly as it was on the day he was taken into the hospital a couple of days before he died. And in that room, behind his chair, is a tall bookshelf, and in the middle of that bookshelf, only almost 2 whole shelves are given over to books on Neoplatonism. And when I saw this, I didn't really know. I had a vague idea of what Neoplatonism was, but it really made an impression on me that so many of these books were on Neoplatonism. What was it about Neoplatonism that had so interested Sangharakshita? What was it that he thought was so compatible with Buddhism that he would give so much time to studying those books? So basically, the Neoplatonism is the philosophical tradition that goes back to Socrates and Plato. So this is in the 5th century BC in ancient Greece. So in that bookshelf, there were all sorts of books relating to Neoplatonists all through the centuries. There was a lot of interest in Platonism in the 3rd century CE. Then in the Renaissance, there was Marsilio Ficino. In the 19th century, there was Thomas Taylor and William Blake. It's a whole tradition. I keep discovering new people in that tradition. Iris Murdoch is in that tradition, the writer and philosopher from the 70s and 80s. So why was Sangharakshita so interested? What was it about Neoplatonism? And essentially, I've gone, in going into that, in asking myself that question, I've learned so much about Buddhism. And it's taken me much deeper into my study of ethics, my understanding of ethics, and my understanding of the metta practice, and the Trikāya Doctrine, which is a very key idea in Buddhist philosophy. I hope I can communicate some of these ideas. there's three words I'd like to introduce. Transcendental, immanence, and emanation. Please don't be put off by those words. They're really powerful words, really interesting words. And I'll explain them as we go along. So the transcendental is basically the Neoplatonic view is that the transcendental is always at work in us. In the modern world, we think of ourselves in a sort of bottom-up sort of way. We think that consciousness is an epiphenomena of the brain, whereas the Neoplatonic view is that consciousness exists and our lives are a product of it, or there's that general sort of reversal of the hierarchy. So there's an openness to what is beyond, and so it's a way of it's a way of thinking that goes against the main current of thinking in the modern world, but in a way which is very aligned with Buddhism. The Buddha was in the same position as Plato. He was trying to describe this non-theistic transcendental. You know, we even associate that word transcendental with God, but both Buddhism and Neoplatonism were trying to encapsulate this non-theistic transcendental, which is almost impossible to talk about. And the Buddha had used various words which had a resonance for his ancient Indian audience. He used words like nirvana, amrita, the deathless, asamskrita, the unconditioned, and so he was wanting to communicate that there is something that the practitioner can access that is beyond death, decay, and impermanence. And it was a challenging thing for him to describe back in a culture that was sort of more familiar with that way of thinking. But it's really difficult in the modern world. In the modern world, we have this situation where sensible people, they don't believe anything without evidence. And that's a really sound approach to life. And whereas in a spiritual context, that can become an obstacle because we need to be willing to listen to what the Buddhist tradition is saying. And we need to find a way of opening ourselves to sort of other possibilities, other ways of seeing. This is what enlightenment is requiring of us. So one of the things that Sangharakshita used to do was he used to tell us to read William Blake, because William Blake is a very particular poet who was writing at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. He was writing at the beginning of this whole phase of our history where this rationalist philosophy was taking over, and there was this awful watered down Christianity which had lost its moral compass essentially. And there's a marvelous poem which I really recommend you to Google. It's just called London, and Blake wrote it in 1794, and it's got this, there's a marvelous phrase in it called which is mind forged manacles. As he was walking through the streets of London, he felt that people had entered into a mindset which was narrowing their capacity to experience life and what it is to be a human being. And it's a really powerful poem, London. by William Blake. So so in Buddhism, you know, Buddha, probably as people who've been around the center might have heard about the Kalama Sutra. The Buddha was very encouraging that people should essentially not believe anything without evidence. However, the Kalama Sutra is also saying that a discerning receptivity to the Buddha's teachings is what's required, and then an application of direct investigation to those teachings. And so this is what we've got to find in our inquiry. I mean, for me, I realized that one of the things that was really helpful in perhaps sort of giving me a sense of the transcendental was a wonderful order member who was the order member who introduced me to Buddhism and taught me meditation, a man called Suvajra, who was the chairman of the Manchester Centre in the northwest of England in the 80s. And he used to tell us about his deep connection with Amitabha Buddha, who is the red Buddha of love. And so I came to see Suvajra as this man who was nourished by his connection with the transcendental, who had this sort of sense of surrender to this principle of love that he was connected with. He's a lovely, soft-spoken man, but he seemed extremely powerful to me. It was as if, for me, he was animated by the transcendental. There was a feeling that there was something living through him. I didn't have words for it at the time, but I saw him as what I now call an other power practitioner, with a sense that he wasn't living his spiritual life just from his own personal effort. There's a sense that he was in touch with a sense of other power, and that was sustaining him. And I always saw Sangharakshita in that way too. So the transcendental in Buddhism and Neoplatonism, one of the ways that makes it easier to get to grips with is that there's two levels of the transcendental. There's the unknowable transcendental, and then there's a sort of reflection of that in a sort of knowable level of the transcendental. The unknowable level is called the Dharmakaya, and in Neoplatonism it's simply called the good, which is a wonderful way of talking about it. And then the knowable level, in Buddhism we call it the Sambhogakaya, and in Neoplatonism there's this Greek word nous, the nous, but which really means the illumined mind. There is a level of our mind which is illumined by the transcendental, and we can access that. We may not be able to know the unknowable Dharmakaya, the unknowable good, but we can intuit it because we're able to, we have experiences of, we might have experiences of imagery, or even just bodily felt experiences. When we have a really great metta bhavana meditation, and we seem to be blazing with metta, it's not really just coming from us. It's we've connected with the Sambhogakaya level of our mind, the illumined mind level, and we're sort of touching into something. Our practice has allowed us to touch into something which is beyond us, and Neoplatonism has a very good word for that. It's participation. We're participating in something that of the beyond. And when we have those experiences, they make a huge effect on us. They sort of shake us up. They demanding that we expand our way of thinking about what it is to be a human being. This is, I mean, one of the things I want to really draw out about the Sambhogakaya is in relation to metta practice, because when we understand that there is this level, there is a sort of resource of metta, there's a pure form of metta on the Sambhogakaya level of mind, on this illumined mind level, then that gives us a way of, not just a way of understanding what happens when we find ourselves sort of transported, but there's a sense that we can turn towards that in receptivity. When we're struggling to find metta, we can open ourselves to this metta in the Sambhogakaya level of mind. There's a sense this is the wonderful thing about the Trikāya Doctrine. The Sambhogakaya is not separate from us, and even the Dharmakaya itself is not separate from us. It's obscured, but we can access it through an attitude of receptivity. Receptivity is a key word for understanding this whole other power, Neoplatonic sensibility. And it's really the essence of the Mahayana, the spirit of the Mahayana in Buddhism. This idea of living the spiritual life as a surrender to something much bigger than ourselves, and letting that animate us, letting that flow through us, letting that support us and comfort us and give us energy and direction. So there's a third level of the Trikāya, the Nirmanakaya, the manifestation level, like the physical, historical existence of Gautama Buddha. Now this is where we come to this next word of these three words, the word immanence. And immanence is usually seen as opposite to transcendental. Like if in Christianity, God is either seen as transcendent or he's seen as immanent, which is a sort of, which was an idea that was initially rejected by the Protestant churches, the idea of watering down this transcendent God. Whereas in Buddhism and Neoplatonism, you just avoid that whole issue because the transcendental is immanent. It's not separate. There's no contradiction. In fact, the Buddha was only able to gain enlightenment because the enlightenment was immanent in him. The transcendental was immanent in him. So in Buddhism, we have this wonderful idea that the transcendental is not separate from us. It's ever present. It's emergent within the mundane. It pervades the mundane. So there's a marvelous poem which some of you may have come across that evokes this idea of immanence. It's called the Song of Zazen by Hakuin, who's a 17th century Zen master, an enlightened Zen master. And this is the last 6 lines of that poem. He says, "Boundless and free is the sky of Samadhi, bright the full moon of wisdom. Truly, is anything missing now? Nirvana is here, before your eyes. This very place is the lotus land. This very body, the Buddha. So, I mean, it's such a powerful poem. You could go through every line. That, you know, that the idea of the sky of samadhi, surrendering into the sky of samadhi. The full moon is a symbol. People might remember the Buddha talking about the finger pointing to the moon. So the full moon of wisdom is the actual experience that the Buddha was pointing to. Truly, is anything missing now? That's the idea that what Hakuin is trying to communicate is the idea that while he's sort of bearing witness to his stable experience of enlightenment, presumably, there's an invitation in these lines. He's saying, you know, be open to the possibility that there's a place, a way of being, a mode of perception where you can be beyond craving. Truly, is anything missing now? Nirvana is here before your eyes. This very place, the lotus land. The lotus land is the great pure land of Amitabha Buddha. And then the final line, this very body, the Buddha. What a marvelous idea, a marvelous invitation. So the third word, emanation. Plato's favorite image for emanation was the shining forth of the light and warmth of the sun. And the implication was that the sun is not diminished as it shines forth its light. But at the same time, the warmth that reaches us is not the heat of the sun. It's a lesser light and a lesser heat. And so this is a key idea in Neoplatonic thought, which is really helpful for understanding the Trikāya Doctrine. The idea that there's an emanation process where each sort of layer of our being is a sort of paler reflection. So there's this, for instance, in relation to metta practice, there's the idea that there is a pure form of metta. The tradition, the Mahayana tradition, called it the great metta. But when it gets to us, our metta is just a pale reflection of that, and that's okay. Particularly if we have a sense that there's a connection between our pale reflection, our little act of kindness, or a pale reflection of this great process, which is somehow absolutely reliable and absolutely, an absolutely reliable resource. That's why we talk about going for refuge. It's like it's a refuge that when we recognize that the transcendental as a completely ever-present reality, it truly becomes something we go for refuge to. It's a source of comfort, a source of inspiration, a source of renewal of our practice. So let's. I'd love to talk about Neoplatonism in the 20th and 21st century, but the key people, there were people like Iris Murdoch, but probably the greatest figure that everyone will have heard of is the great psychologist Carl Jung. Carl Jung was essentially bringing a Neoplatonic sensibility and a huge amount of study, was bringing a Neoplatonic sensibility to psychology, to psychoanalysis. and he created his own sort of incredibly rich sort of brand of psychoanalysis, which is still, people are poring over his books and still learning. And it's as if Jung was writing for the 21st century. People weren't quite ready for his ideas. He was writing at a time when the world was really stuck in a deep rationalism that was completely the antithesis of Carl Jung. But he set down those ideas and he established something that continues to nourish the world, because it's this way of thinking where the transcendental is taken seriously. And but the person who is probably the most important that I've found in my life is JRR Tolkien. Tolkien was a Neoplatonist, and in creating his Lord of the Rings stories, he was undertaking to tell stories that were woven through with Neoplatonic ideas at a time when the world was completely, his fellow professors in the university, in Oxford were locked into their sort of rationalist philosophy. So he was, in writing those books, he really, I believe, was a tremendous gift for the world. I could just go through the characters and how they relate. For instance, Aragorn is, in Neoplatonic terms, he's Plato's philosopher king. One of Plato's books, called The Republic, he was talking about an ideal society, and he said, in an ideal society, you want the people ruling the society need to be people who are actually more interested in meditation and ethics than ruling. So, and this is what the figure of Aragorn is. He's a philosopher king. He's a meditative, contemplative man whose greatest love is to sort of be in quietness, to be in meditative connection with the good, as the Neoplatonists call the highest. And then there's Gandalf, who always recognizes the good at work. So these, right through the Lord of the Rings stories, are these wonderful comments from Gandalf where he shows his trust that the good is at work, that if we act ethically, if we act compassionately, then we're supporting the unfoldment of the world's process, and we're supporting the good. But the good is always at work, even when evil seems to be so concrete. There's this idea that evil is just a denial of the good. It's exactly the same as the Buddhist tradition. When the Buddha gains his enlightenment and Mara is raining down sort of arrows and spears on him, and they're turning into flower petals, there is this sense that the good is the greatest power in the universe. And Tolkien evokes that same idea very, very powerfully in those books. And we could talk briefly about the elves. The elves was Tolkien's imagination of a fictional Neoplatonic culture where people are devoted to the transcendent good, the one, while recognizing that the transcendent is always immanent in the natural world. So there's a beautiful aesthetic, there's a wonderful aesthetic sensibility in the elves. beauty of their world. And they have a sort of melancholy wisdom because they recognize that there's a sort of degradation process where although the good is the ultimate reality of the universe, pervading the universe, the capacity of this world to create a reflection of that is sort of, it diminishes over time. So finally, there's the hobbits. What's so wonderful about the hobbits, and this was a fresh idea that Tolkien introduced. He introduced the idea that some of the best people have an instinctive and unconscious connection with the good. They don't necessarily have grand ideas. They're not necessarily the initiators of heroic ventures, but they respond. It was like it was Tolkien celebrating those people who he'd come across. He'd fought alongside lots of infantrymen in the First World War, and he saw this wonderful willingness to respond to the needs of the situation, and he put his respect and his gratitude into these stories about the hobbits. So the main implication I want to draw out is in relation to metta bhavana, as I was saying, that by bringing this Neoplatonic sensibility, this idea that there is a pure form of metta somewhere, it doesn't matter whether we think of it as inside ourselves or beyond us, it's other power. Yeah, the idea of being open to other power relative to the egoic mind is so powerful, particularly when we're stuck. Some people, they can flow along, but I know that I got stuck. I basically gave up for many years on meditation, even though you might think I'd had experiences which would set me on the path. But I think it's really important to sort of take seriously this idea that there is an illumined level of the mind, a Sambhogakaya level of the mind, which we can turn to in receptivity when we're needing to feel supported. And that in receiving that gift, we're then able to give the gift of metta. And I'm reminded, as I think about this, of Buddha Pali talks beautifully about how she found as a way of connecting with metta, she would imagine herself curling up in the lap of the Buddha and resting in the Buddha's love. And what a how powerful that was for her in becoming really reliable. She knew that was a reliable way of connecting with self-metta. And Kamala May's also spoken about the wonderful stability that came into her practice when she realized that metta was always there. She could receive it. So I'm hoping that in our little discussion, we'll share ideas about using intuition and imagination to open up our metta practice. I just thought to finish, I was trying to imagine what the Buddha's advice to us as Buddhists might be if he was alive today. And for some reason, remembering Plato's idea of the sun as a symbol of the good, emanating its blessings, I thought he might say to us, familiarize yourself with the sun of loving kindness that is shining within us all. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.